The final gavel fell in Tokyo on December 23, 1948. 7 men who had once commanded millions of soldiers and controlled the destiny of nations now faced their ultimate judgment. These were not ordinary war criminals. They were the architects of imperial ambition, the masterminds behind some of history's most devastating campaigns. What you're about to witness are the final chapters in the lives of Japan's most powerful military leaders. Men who went from commanding vast armies to facing the hangman's noose. Their downfall was as spectacular as their rise to power, and their final moments reveal the true cost of unchecked military ambition. General Hideki Tojo stood as the embodiment of Japanese military aggression during World War II. As Prime Minister from 1941 to 1944, he had orchestrated Japan's entry into the Pacific War and overseen the expansion of the Japanese Empire across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. When Allied forces occupied Japan in 1945, Tojo knew his fate was sealed. On September 11, 1945, as American military police surrounded his residence in Setagaya, Tokyo, the former prime minister made a desperate attempt to avoid capture. He shot himself in the chest with a pistol, but the bullet missed his heart by mere inches. American medics rushed him to a military hospital, where they saved the life of the man they would later put on trial for war crimes. Tojo's failed attempt at taking his own life became a symbol of the desperate final acts of Japan's wartime leadership. During his recovery, Tojo transformed from the defiant military leader into a man grappling with the weight of his decisions. The general who had once proclaimed that death was lighter than a feather when it came to serving the emperor now faced the prospect of being judged by his former enemies. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal began on May 3, 1946. Tojo entered the courtroom in a khaki military uniform, stripped of all insignia and decorations. The man who had once wielded absolute power now sat in the defendant's dock, listening to prosecutors detail his role in planning aggressive war and authorizing brutal treatment of prisoners of war. Throughout the 2.5-year trial, Tojo maintained his composure with characteristic military bearing. He accepted full responsibility for Japan's actions during his tenure, stating that all decisions had been made in service to the emperor and the Japanese people. His testimony revealed a complex figure, not the caricature of evil often portrayed, but a career military officer who believed genuinely in the righteousness of Japan's cause. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Tojo's involvement in planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, the invasion of Southeast Asia, and the establishment of policies that led to the mistreatment of Allied prisoners and civilian populations. Documents bearing his signature authorized the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, where thousands of Allied prisoners and Asian laborers perished under brutal conditions. As the trial progressed, Tojo's defense team argued that he had acted within the bounds of Japanese law and military tradition. They portrayed him as a loyal servant of the state rather than a war criminal. However, the weight of evidence against him proved insurmountable. On November 12, 1948, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Tojo was found guilty on 7 counts, including waging aggressive war and authorizing the mistreatment of prisoners of war. The judges sentenced him to death by hanging, but Tojo's story was far from over. His final weeks would reveal a man undergoing a profound spiritual transformation that would shock even his captors. In the weeks following his death sentence, Hideki Tojo underwent a remarkable change that puzzled both his guards and fellow prisoners. The former prime minister, who had embodied the militant spirit of Imperial Japan, began meeting regularly with American military chaplains. Tojo's cell in Sugamo prison became an unlikely place of religious reflection. He spent hours reading Christian literature and engaging in theological discussions with prison chaplains. This spiritual journey represented a dramatic departure from the Shinto beliefs and Bushido code that had guided his entire military career. During these final weeks, Tojo also began writing extensively, letters to his family, reflections on his life, and most surprisingly, expressions of regret for the suffering caused by the war. These writings, discovered decades later, revealed a man grappling with the magnitude of death and destruction that had occurred under his leadership. The former general's daily routine in prison was strictly regimented. He woke at dawn, participated in mandatory exercise periods, and spent most of his time reading and writing. Guards reported that he maintained perfect military posture, even while walking to meals, as if his decades of military conditioning could not be broken even in captivity. On December 22, 1948, Tojo received his final visitors, his wife Katsuko, and their children. The meeting lasted exactly 30 minutes, conducted under strict supervision with guards present throughout. Witnesses reported that Tojo maintained his composure, offering words of encouragement to his family, rather than dwelling on his impending fate. The execution was scheduled for December 23rd at 12:01 a.m. As midnight approached, Tojo refused the traditional last meal, stating that he preferred to fast before his death. He spent his final hours in prayer and meditation, a stark contrast to the image of the militant warlord who had once terrorized the Pacific. At 11:45 p.m., guards entered his cell to begin the final procedures. Tojo stood immediately, straightened his prison uniform, and walked with steady steps toward the execution chamber. The man who had once commanded millions of soldiers now faced his final march alone. The execution chamber at Sugamo Prison was a sparse, clinical space designed for efficiency rather than ceremony. 7 condemned war criminals would meet their fate that night, but Tojo's execution carried particular symbolic weight as the former prime minister and architect of Japan's wartime policies. But before we witness the final moments of Tojo and his fellow condemned generals, we must examine the case of another powerful figure whose crimes shocked even the hardened prosecutors at the Tokyo Tribunal. General Iwani Matsui commanded the Japanese forces during one of the most controversial episodes of the Pacific War, the capture of Nanking in December 1937. What followed became known as the Nanking Massacre, an event that would define Matsui's legacy and ultimately seal his fate at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Matsui was a career military officer who had risen through the ranks during Japan's period of rapid modernization. Unlike some of his contemporaries who embraced militant nationalism, Matsui had actually spent time studying in China and claimed to have deep respect for Chinese culture and people. This background made his role in the Nanking events all the more complex and controversial. When Japanese forces approached Nanking in December 1937, Matsui issued explicit orders regarding the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. His written directives called for disciplined behavior and respect for non-combatants. However, what actually occurred in Nanking bore little resemblance to these official orders. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers engaged in widespread violence against the civilian population of Nanking. International observers, including Western businessmen and missionaries who remained in the city, documented systematic atrocities against unarmed civilians. The exact number of casualties remains disputed, but estimates range from tens of thousands to several 100,000 victims. During the Tokyo Tribunal, prosecutors presented extensive evidence linking Matsui to these events. They argued that as commanding officer, he bore responsibility for the actions of his subordinates, regardless of his stated intentions. Witness testimony and documentary evidence painted a picture of a commander who had either authorized the violence or failed in his duty to prevent it. Matsui's defense team argued that their client had been genuinely shocked by reports of atrocities and had taken immediate steps to restore discipline once he learned of the situation. They presented evidence of his orders to court-martial soldiers who had engaged in unauthorized violence and his efforts to establish civilian safe zones within the city. The general himself maintained throughout the trial that he had never intended for civilians to be harmed, and that he deeply regretted the events that had occurred under his command. His testimony revealed a complex figure, a military professional caught between his genuine respect for Chinese culture and the brutal realities of warfare in the 1930s. Medical examinations during his imprisonment revealed that Matsui was suffering from various age-related ailments that had been exacerbated by the stress of the trial. At 70 years old, he was among the oldest defendants at the tribunal, and his physical condition deteriorated significantly during the lengthy proceedings. Despite his advanced age and failing health, Matsui maintained his dignity throughout the trial. He answered questions directly and accepted responsibility for events that had occurred under his command, even while maintaining that he had not intended for atrocities to occur. On November 12, 1948, the tribunal found Matsui guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity related to the Nanking Massacre. The judges determined that his failure to prevent atrocities by troops under his command constituted criminal negligence, regardless of his stated intentions or subsequent attempts to restore discipline. The death sentence for Matsui represented one of the most controversial verdicts of the Tokyo Tribunal. Unlike other condemned generals who had clearly authorized aggressive warfare, Matsui's case centered on the question of command responsibility and the extent to which military leaders could be held accountable for the actions of their subordinates. As Matsui awaited execution alongside his fellow condemned generals, his case continued to generate debate about the nature of military leadership and moral responsibility in warfare. But his story would soon be overshadowed by an even more shocking case, that of a general whose crimes extended far beyond the battlefield. General Heitaro Kimura's path to the gallows began with his appointment as commander of Japanese forces in Burma in 1944. What he authorized during his tenure in Southeast Asia would place him among the most reviled figures of the Pacific War and ensure his place in the dock at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Kimura had built his reputation as an efficient administrator and logistical expert within the Japanese military hierarchy. His organizational skills made him an ideal choice for managing the complex supply lines and infrastructure projects that Japan required to maintain its hold on Southeast Asia. However, these same administrative talents would become instruments of tremendous human suffering. The Burma-Thailand Railway Project, also known as the Death Railway, became Kimura's most infamous legacy. This 415-kilometer rail line was designed to provide a supply route for Japanese forces in Burma, bypassing the sea routes that were increasingly threatened by Allied naval power. The construction required massive amounts of manual labor under extremely harsh conditions. Kimura authorized the use of Allied prisoners of war and civilian laborers from across Southeast Asia for the railway construction. His orders specified aggressive completion schedules that prioritized speed over human welfare. The general's administrative efficiency translated into a brutal system that treated human beings as expendable resources. Over 60,000 Allied prisoners of war worked on the railway project under Kimura's oversight. These men, already weakened by months or years of captivity, were forced to perform backbreaking labor in tropical conditions with inadequate food, medical care, and shelter. The death rate among prisoners reached catastrophic levels. Even more devastating was the fate of the estimated 200,000 civilian laborers recruited from Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, and other occupied territories. Many of these workers had been promised fair wages and decent conditions, only to find themselves trapped in a system of forced labor that showed little regard for human life. During the Tokyo Tribunal, survivors testified about the conditions they had endured under Kimura's command. Former prisoners described 18-hour workdays, starvation rations, and brutal punishment for those unable to meet impossible quotas. Medical officers testified about tropical diseases that ravaged the workforce while adequate medical supplies were denied. The prosecution presented documents bearing Kimura's signature that authorized increases in work quotas despite reports of rising death rates among laborers. His administrative reports to Tokyo headquarters revealed a cold calculation that measured progress in terms of rail kilometers completed rather than human lives lost. Kimura's defense team argued that their client had been following orders from higher authorities and had been under tremendous pressure to complete the railway project. They claimed that he had worked within the constraints of wartime conditions and limited resources to provide for the welfare of workers and prisoners. However, evidence presented at the trial painted a different picture. Witnesses testified that Kimura had rejected requests for additional medical supplies and food rations, stating that the completion of the railway took precedence over worker welfare. His own reports to headquarters boasted about maintaining construction schedules despite high casualty rates. The general's behavior during the trial reflected his bureaucratic background. He answered questions with technical precision and maintained detailed records, even while imprisoned. His testimony revealed a mind that compartmentalized human suffering as an administrative problem to be managed rather than a moral crisis requiring action. On November 12, 1948, the tribunal found Kimura guilty of war crimes related to the mistreatment of prisoners of war and civilian populations. The judges determined that his administrative role in authorizing and maintaining the conditions on the death railway constituted a clear violation of international law and basic human decency. The death sentence for Kimura represented justice for the thousands who had perished under his administrative efficiency. But his case also raised disturbing questions about how ordinary bureaucratic processes could become instruments of mass suffering when divorced from moral considerations. As Kimura awaited execution, he continued his meticulous record-keeping habits, maintaining detailed journals about prison life and writing extensive letters to his family. His final weeks would reveal whether the man behind the administrative machinery possessed any recognition of the human cost of his efficiency. General Akira Muto represented a different breed of Japanese military leader, one who had risen through the Army's intelligence and staff officer ranks rather than through field command. His analytical mind and strategic thinking had made him an invaluable asset to Japan's military leadership, but these same qualities would ultimately contribute to his downfall at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Muto's military career had been built on his exceptional ability to analyze complex strategic situations and develop comprehensive operational plans. He had served in various staff positions throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, gaining a reputation as one of the Army's most capable strategic thinkers. His appointment as Chief of Staff of the Japanese Army in the Philippines in 1944 placed him at the center of Japan's desperate attempts to maintain control of this strategically crucial territory. The Philippines campaign would become one of the most brutal theaters of the Pacific War, with devastating consequences for both military personnel and civilian populations. Under Muto's staff leadership, Japanese forces implemented a series of defensive strategies designed to make the American reconquest of the Philippines as costly as possible. These tactics included the extensive use of civilian populations as human shields, the destruction of infrastructure to deny its use to advancing Allied forces, and the implementation of harsh measures against suspected resistance activities. The Battle of Manila in early 1945 became the defining moment of Muto's command. As American forces approached the Philippine capital, Japanese units under his staff direction engaged in systematic destruction of the city and widespread violence against the civilian population. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians lost their lives during the month-long battle. During the Tokyo Tribunal, prosecutors presented extensive evidence linking Muto to orders that resulted in atrocities against civilian populations. His signature appeared on directives that authorized harsh reprisals against suspected guerrilla activities and orders that prioritized military objectives over civilian welfare. Witness testimony revealed the impact of Muto's strategic decisions on ordinary Filipino families. Survivors described how Japanese forces, following orders from Muto's headquarters, had systematically destroyed hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure to deny their potential use to Allied forces. The prosecution argued that Muto's analytical approach to warfare had led him to view civilian casualties as acceptable costs in achieving military objectives. They presented evidence showing that he had received reports about atrocities against civilians, but had failed to take corrective action or modify his operational directives. Muto's defense team portrayed him as a staff officer who had been following established military doctrine and higher-level strategic directives. They argued that he had been operating within the accepted parameters of warfare and had not personally ordered specific atrocities against civilian populations. However, the tribunal focused on Muto's role in developing and implementing strategic plans that inevitably led to massive civilian casualties. The judges examined whether his staff work demonstrated a pattern of callous disregard for civilian welfare in pursuit of military objectives. During his testimony, Muto maintained the analytical demeanor that had characterized his military career. He presented detailed explanations of his strategic reasoning and defended his decisions as militarily sound within the context of Japan's desperate strategic situation in 1944 and 1945. The general's prison writings during the trial period revealed a complex intellectual struggling to reconcile his strategic mindset with the moral weight of civilian casualties. His letters to family members showed a man grappling with questions about the relationship between military necessity and moral responsibility. On November 12, 1948, the tribunal found Muto guilty of war crimes related to his role in authorizing operations that resulted in extensive civilian casualties. The judges determined that his staff work demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing military objectives over the protection of non-combatant populations. The death sentence for Muto represented a significant expansion of the concept of command responsibility to include staff officers who developed strategic plans. His case established important precedents about the legal and moral responsibility of military planners for the foreseeable consequences of their strategic decisions. As Muto awaited execution, he continued the intellectual activities that had defined his career, writing extensively about military history and strategy. His final weeks would reveal whether his analytical mind could ultimately comprehend the human cost of strategic thinking divorced from moral considerations. Field Marshal Shunroku Hata had achieved the pinnacle of Japanese military honor during his long career, but his final command would lead him directly to the defendant's dock at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. As the commander responsible for Japanese forces in China during some of the most brutal phases of the occupation, Hata's legacy became forever linked with systematic atrocities against civilian populations. Hata's military career spanned nearly 4 decades, during which he had earned recognition as one of Japan's most experienced field commanders. He had participated in numerous campaigns during Japan's expansion across Asia and had been promoted to the prestigious rank of Field Marshal in recognition of his service to the emperor. His appointment as commander of Japanese forces in central China in 1941 placed him in control of vast territories and hundreds of thousands of troops. This position made him directly responsible for implementing Japanese occupation policies across some of China's most populated regions. Under Hata's command, Japanese forces engaged in systematic campaigns of terror against Chinese civilian populations suspected of supporting resistance activities. These operations, euphemistically termed pacification campaigns, involved the destruction of entire villages and the elimination of populations in areas deemed hostile to Japanese rule. The infamous 3-all policy, kill all, burn all, destroy all, was implemented extensively in territories under Hata's command. This strategy aimed to deny resources and support to Chinese resistance forces by eliminating the civilian infrastructure that sustained them. The human cost of this policy was devastating. During the Tokyo Tribunal, prosecutors presented evidence showing that Hata had not only authorized these brutal campaigns, but had actively supervised their implementation. His field reports to Tokyo headquarters detailed the progress of pacification operations in terms of villages destroyed and populations eliminated. Survivors of Hata's campaigns testified about the systematic nature of the atrocities committed by forces under his command. Witnesses described how Japanese units would arrive in villages with prepared lists of suspected resistance sympathizers and would proceed to eliminate entire families associated with these individuals. The prosecution argued that Hata's implementation of the 3-all policy constituted genocide, a systematic attempt to eliminate portions of the Chinese population through organized violence. They presented documentary evidence showing that he had received detailed reports about the scale of civilian casualties, but had continued and even intensified these operations. Medical experts testified about the methods used by forces under Hata's command, describing systematic patterns of violence that indicated organized, rather than spontaneous brutality. The clinical precision of these atrocities suggested careful planning and coordination at the highest levels of command. Hata's defense team argued that their client had been implementing established Japanese military doctrine in response to widespread guerrilla warfare. They claimed that the harsh measures were militarily necessary responses to irregular warfare tactics employed by Chinese resistance forces. However, the tribunal examined whether the scale and systematic nature of civilian casualties under Hata's command went far beyond what could be justified as military necessity. The evidence suggested a deliberate policy of terrorizing civilian populations rather than legitimate counterinsurgency operations. During his testimony, Hata maintained the bearing of a career military officer, accepting responsibility for operations under his command while defending their military necessity. His responses revealed a mindset that viewed civilian casualties as inevitable consequences of effective military operations against irregular forces. The field marshal's prison writings during the trial showed a man struggling to understand why actions he had considered militarily sound were being characterized as criminal. His letters revealed the worldview of a career officer who had spent decades viewing warfare through the lens of military effectiveness rather than humanitarian constraints. On November 12, 1948, the tribunal found Hata guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity related to his implementation of systematic policies that resulted in massive civilian casualties. The judges determined that the scale and organized nature of atrocities under his command constituted clear violations of international law. The death sentence for Hata represented justice for the countless Chinese civilians who had perished under his pacification campaigns. His case established important legal precedents about the responsibility of military commanders for implementing policies that systematically target civilian populations. As Hata awaited execution, he continued to maintain his military bearing and discipline, His final weeks would test whether decades of military conditioning could prepare a man for the ultimate consequence of his command decisions. Among the condemned war criminals awaiting execution was one figure who stood apart from the military generals, Koki Hirota, the only civilian among those sentenced to death. As a former prime minister and foreign minister, Hirota represented the political leadership that had guided Japan toward aggressive war and alliance with Nazi Germany. Hirota's path to the gallows was unique among the condemned. Unlike the military leaders who had commanded troops in battle, his crimes were those of diplomacy and political leadership. As foreign minister from 1933 to 1936 and prime minister from 1936 to 1937, he had played a crucial role in shaping Japan's aggressive foreign policy. During his tenure as foreign minister, Hirota had overseen the negotiation of the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany, creating the foundation for the Axis alliance that would eventually lead to global warfare. His diplomatic initiatives had isolated Japan from the Western democracies while aligning the country with fascist powers in Europe. The prosecution at the Tokyo Tribunal argued that Hirota's diplomatic policies had made aggressive war inevitable. They presented evidence showing that his negotiations with Germany and Italy had been specifically designed to create a military alliance against the United States and Great Britain. Hirota had also served as prime minister during the early phases of Japan's expanded military operations in China. His government had approved the deployment of additional troops to China and had authorized the aggressive policies that led to full-scale warfare between Japan and China in 1937. Unlike the military defendants who could claim to have been following orders, Hirota bore responsibility for the political decisions that had set Japan's course toward global conflict. His diplomatic initiatives had created the international framework within which Japanese military aggression could flourish. During the trial, witnesses testified about Hirota's role in cabinet discussions regarding military operations in China. Government documents revealed his support for aggressive military policies, and his belief that war with China was both inevitable and desirable for Japan's strategic interests. The prosecution argued that Hirota's diplomatic and political leadership constituted conspiracy to wage aggressive war, making him equally responsible for subsequent military atrocities as the generals who had implemented these policies on the battlefield. Hirota's defense team argued that their client had been a career diplomat who had worked within established international law to advance Japan's legitimate security interests. They claimed that his policies had been defensive responses to perceived threats from communist forces in Asia. However, the tribunal focused on Hirota's active role in creating the diplomatic framework for aggressive war. The evidence showed that his policies had been designed specifically to prepare Japan for military conflict with Western powers, rather than to preserve peace in Asia. During his imprisonment, Hirota maintained the dignified bearing of a career diplomat. His prison writings revealed a man who continued to believe in the righteousness of Japan's cause, even while facing the ultimate penalty for his political leadership. The former prime minister's case raised important questions about the responsibility of political leaders for military actions taken by their successors. His diplomatic initiatives had created conditions that made aggressive war possible, even though he had not personally ordered specific military operations. On November 12, 1948, the tribunal found Hirota guilty of conspiracy to wage aggressive war and crimes against peace. The judges determined that his diplomatic leadership had been essential to Japan's preparation for aggressive warfare, making him equally culpable with the military leaders who had implemented these policies. The death sentence for Hirota established important precedents about the criminal responsibility of political leaders for creating conditions that lead to aggressive war. His case demonstrated that civilian leaders could not escape accountability by claiming they had not personally ordered military operations. As the only civilian among the condemned, Hirota's final weeks in prison took on symbolic significance as representing the political leadership that had led Japan into global warfare. December 23, 1948, began like any other day at Sugamo prison, but as midnight approached, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. 7 condemned war criminals were spending their final hours on Earth, each coping with impending death in his own way. Hideki Tojo continued his spiritual preparations, meeting with prison chaplains and spending long periods in prayer. The former prime minister who had once embodied Japan's militant nationalism now sought comfort in Christian teachings about forgiveness and redemption. Iwane Matsui, despite his advanced age and failing health, maintained his dignity throughout the final day. The elderly general spent his time writing final letters to his family, and reflecting on his long military career. His guards reported that he showed remarkable composure for a man facing execution within hours. Heitaro Kimura approached his final hours with the same administrative precision that had characterized his military career. He organized his personal effects, completed his final correspondence, and maintained detailed notes about prison procedures even on his last day of life. Akira Muto continued his intellectual pursuits until the end, spending his final hours writing about military strategy and history. The staff officer who had planned campaigns affecting millions of lives now focused his analytical mind on understanding the historical significance of his own fate. Field Marshal Shunroku Hata maintained perfect military bearing throughout his final day. The career officer who had commanded vast armies now faced his ultimate test of military discipline, as he prepared to meet death with the same stoic resolve he had demanded from his troops. Koki Hirota, the lone civilian among the condemned, spent his final hours writing political observations and reflections on Japan's future. The former diplomat who had helped create the conditions for global war now contemplated the world that would emerge from the ashes of his policies. The seventh condemned man, Seishiro Itagaki, another general convicted for his role in aggressive war planning, maintained silence during his final hours, declining visits from chaplains and spending his time in solitary reflection. As 11 p.m. approached, prison officials began the final procedures. Each condemned man was visited by guards who verified his identity and informed him that execution would proceed as scheduled. The military precision of these procedures seemed fitting for men who had spent their careers within disciplined military organizations. The execution chamber at Sugamo Prison had been prepared according to strict protocols established by the Allied occupation authorities. 7 gallows stood ready, each positioned to ensure efficient and simultaneous executions. The symbolic significance of executing all condemned war criminals at the same time was not lost on those present. At 11:45 p.m., guards began escorting the condemned men from their cells to the execution chamber. Each man walked the final corridor, accompanied by guards and chaplains, though several of the condemned had declined religious assistance during their final moments. Tojo led the procession, walking with steady steps and maintaining the military bearing that had characterized his entire career. Behind him followed the other condemned generals and the civilian Hirota, each man facing his final walk with whatever dignity he could muster. The execution chamber was witnessed by a select group of Allied officials, military officers, and journalists. The presence of these witnesses ensured that the executions would be properly documented and that news of the final justice would reach the world. At exactly 12:01 a.m. on December 23, 1948, the sentences were carried out simultaneously. The 7 men who had once wielded immense power over millions of lives now faced the ultimate consequence of their wartime actions. Their deaths marked the end of one of history's most significant war crimes trials. The bodies were cremated immediately after execution, with ashes scattered at sea to prevent the creation of memorial sites that might glorify the condemned war criminals. This final measure ensured that the men who had led Japan into aggressive war would leave no physical legacy for future generations to venerate. News of the executions reached Japan and the world within hours. The deaths of these 7 men represented the final act of justice for the countless victims of Japanese aggression during World War II. Their executions marked the end of an era and the beginning of Japan's transformation into a peaceful, democratic nation. The execution of these 7 war criminals at Sugamo Prison represented more than just the final punishment of individual men. It marked the culmination of humanity's first comprehensive attempt to hold military and political leaders accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The cases of Tojo, Matsui, Kimura, Muto, Hata, Hirota, and Itagaki established crucial legal precedents that continue to influence international justice today. Their trials demonstrated that following orders or claiming military necessity could not excuse systematic atrocities against civilian populations. The transformation of these once powerful leaders, from commanders of vast military forces to condemned prisoners facing execution, revealed the ultimate accountability that democratic justice demands from those who wield power over others. Their final hours showed both the human capacity for spiritual transformation and the inexorable consequences of criminal leadership. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, despite its limitations and controversies, established principles of international law that continue to guide efforts to prevent aggressive war and protect civilian populations during armed conflicts. The executions of December 23, 1948, marked a watershed moment in the development of international criminal justice. These 7 men had risen to the pinnacles of military and political power during one of history's most devastating conflicts. Their fall from supreme authority to the gallows demonstrated that no position, however exalted, could provide immunity from accountability for crimes against humanity. The immediate aftermath of the executions sent shockwaves throughout Japan and the international community. For many Japanese citizens, the deaths of these former leaders symbolized the complete transformation of their nation from militaristic empire to occupied territory. The executions served as a stark reminder that the old order had been permanently swept away. In the months following the executions, Japan began its remarkable transformation into a peaceful, democratic society. The new constitution, drafted under Allied supervision, explicitly renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation. This dramatic shift from the militaristic ideology that had driven these 7 men to their deaths represented one of the most complete national transformations in modern history. The international community watched closely as the precedents established at Tokyo began to influence legal thinking around the world. The concept of crimes against humanity, still relatively new in international law, gained greater acceptance and definition through the detailed proceedings and judgments of the tribunal. For the families of the executed men, the years following the executions brought both shame and a complex process of reconciliation with their relatives' actions. Many struggled to reconcile their personal memories of fathers, husbands, and brothers with the documented evidence of the crimes these men had committed or authorized. The victims of these men's policies, the survivors of the Death Railway, the Nanking Massacre, the Manila Destruction, and countless other atrocities, received a measure of justice through these executions. However, for many survivors, no punishment could truly balance the scale of suffering they had endured. The legacy of their trials and executions extends far beyond the immediate justice they represented. The legal precedents established at Tokyo influenced the development of the Geneva Conventions, the establishment of the International Criminal Court, and ongoing efforts to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity worldwide. Modern international criminal law continues to grapple with questions first addressed in the cases of these 7 men. How should command responsibility be defined? What constitutes adequate knowledge of subordinates' criminal actions? When does political leadership cross the line into criminal conspiracy? These questions remain relevant as contemporary tribunals address crimes in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, and other conflict zones. The physical site of Sugamo prison no longer exists. It was demolished decades ago and replaced with a commercial development. However, the legal and moral precedents established within its walls continue to shape international justice. The executions that took place there in the early hours of December 23, 1948, remain a defining moment in humanity's ongoing struggle to establish accountability for mass atrocities. Their stories serve as enduring reminders of the human cost of unchecked military ambition and the essential role of international law in protecting innocent populations from the ravages of aggressive warfare. The ultimate price these leaders paid for their crimes stands as a warning to future generations about the consequences of choosing power over principle. The 7 men who walked to their deaths that December night had once commanded the destiny of nations and the lives of millions. Their final march to the gallows serves as a testament to the principle that no individual, regardless of rank or authority, stands above the moral law that binds all humanity together. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.